Hi, in this video I want to talk about making the value exchanges between escaping a pain, deprivation, and preventing pain. So in this video I want to make a comparison and use maybe a thought experiment um, how maybe one person may have to avoid a pain, but he's going to allow other people to escape a pain. So four people are in pain, but he has to go through the pain. Obviously, it's good for him to go through the pain to one person to go through the pain, depending on the pain, if they're going through the exact same pain, obviously no one person deserves to go through the pain of 100 people to experience or prevent, say, 5 people from experiencing some kind of pain, because it's obviously better for 5 people to have 5 broken thumbs as opposed to one person have 2 broken legs, um, or 5 broken pinkies as opposed to one person having 2 broken legs. So I think that's a little more of an easy value equation. Obviously, it's more individual circumstances of a broken thumb or a broken pinky, but it's still a broken leg. 2 broken legs, generally speaking, is much worse than, say, breaking 5 of your fingers. And especially when it's the smallest finger on you and it's on 5 different people. So I think a simple value equation and using examples to make those value judgments. I think that's a good example when you can measure value judgments, and it comes down to either more pain or less pain. And I've mentioned that before. There's either more pain or there's less pain, and it's just knowing if there's more or less pain. There's no ambiguous pain. There's no this pain or that pain. There's more pain or less pain. There's no stinging pain, numb pain, aching pain. It doesn't really matter. There's more or less pain in the end. Whichever one's causing more pain is the thing that matters most, and it's about making the value judgment of making the person go through less pain to have more pain be avoided. So if a person has to go through less pain to have more pain to be avoided, then yes, you make that value judgment. But if if people are just curing their boredom by bringing, 4 people are curing their boredom by going to a theme park, and the one person doesn't want to go to a theme park because they're deathly afraid, they have an irrational fear of going to the theme park, and they may almost end up having a heart attack because they go to the theme park. They have a panic attack or whatever, an anxiety attack because they were brought to the theme park an episode. Then in many cases, curing your deprivation isn't worth giving the person a horrible experience, a horrible active, and a horrible pain in and of itself, as opposed to the deprivation you have to take 2 steps to get to, as opposed to the one step of just causing a person overt pain because of their the pain that you're bringing, the fact that you're bringing them along with you, or any number of other examples that you can use to replace that one. You shouldn't cause more pain to someone if you're trying to avoid deprivation. A person, obviously there's value judgments to make, and you going to the theme park and do all sorts of good things, but bringing the one person along could obviously cause that person all sorts of unnecessary suffering. And what the end saying is that any amount of suffering is not worth any amount of gratification or satisfaction. Once you have one person saying ow in the end, unless you're fixing something in reaction to that ow, that ow is not fixing anything, it's not serving any function. And if you're just fixing what you've already broken, or you're preventing something you've already broken, or you're just fixing something that you've already broken, or it's possible to break, then you're not really accomplishing anything. That's where once you've said ow, you've already gone through the negative, and you're already going downhill from there, and it's not worth it at that point. So, yes, I mean, once you go through the ow, it doesn't mean anything at that point. The positive you're experiencing is just avoiding the negative that you had to go through to get to that positive, right back to where the positive that you were at to begin with. So you're just filling up the tank again. You're filling up the happy meter, or you're filling up the meter to avoid your melancholy and your despondency. So it doesn't really accomplish anything. But if you're, like I mentioned before, if you're making the value judgment of I've got to do this of making these 4 people avoid the same fate, then I guess if I experience the same pain as them, I can make the value judgment. We can use hypotheticals in these circumstances to at least get or examples, or yes, these metaphors to get the point across, but they're real practical examples. They're like definitions of reality, even though we have not necessarily the tools to measure them. If I have to go through a broken leg to save 5 people from having a broken leg, generally speaking, since I don't necessarily know the value judgment, unless I ask a person if they mind having a broken leg, it would only be reasonable for me to say out of those 5 people, it would be best for me to break my leg, even if it were just to save 2 people from breaking their leg. But if I had to break my leg to prevent 5 broken thumbs, like I mentioned, I would almost say that value judgment, even though you don't have the obligation to make it begin with, you have the obligation, but that doesn't mean you're going to make the right decision. And we're not saying you have to make the right decision. We're just saying it's an obligation. It's the truth. You're preventing more harm, and that's the ultimate goal. If you don't believe it, obviously it's not the goal. But obviously, like I mentioned, the 1 broken leg or 2 broken legs as opposed to the 5 broken thumbs, it would be less of an obligation to save 5 people from having 2 broken legs as opposed to you just breaking your 2 legs. But obviously, those things don't necessarily exist in reality where you have to break your 2 legs to save 5 people from breaking their 2 legs. It's just about understanding these examples to understand exactly how they can compare and how at least these comparisons can be made and how they do mean something and they can be compared. Even if you can't put a number on them, they can be compared, and you know that these numbers they actually exist. You just don't know what they are. But there's an obligation there, and that obligation is the thing that actually exists. That's something you can't avoid. The obligation is something you cannot avoid. Knowing the numbers and saying you're ignorant of exactly knowing what's going on is I guess is a good enough human reason of ignorance to say you can get away with not having the obligation. But the thing is you have the obligation. Just don't rationalize it by saying that it's not true. It is true, and that's the thing. Just don't deny the truth just because you don't know the numbers. Just say, I don't know the numbers, therefore I'm just going to be a selfish asshole, bastard, piece of shit, and walk away from the problem. I'm not gonna. I could end up, making up for it in the future before avoiding it. Whatever it may be, you were still an asshole in the circumstance at the very least, or you still avoided your obligation in that circumstance to put less emotion to the statement, or put less human emotion or judgment to the statement. Say you're an asshole. But the obligation is still there. There's either more obligation, less obligation, more pain, less pain, a more reasonable value equation or a less reasonable value equation, and it's about making that right decision. But the decision is not always going to be met, and that's the thing. That's the chaotic mechanism of this game. The right decision is not always going to be made to prevent the suffering. But the thing is, the chaotic mechanism was also deterministic. Once it's happened, that was also set in stone. The chaotic mechanism is looking forward. The deterministic mechanism is looking back. We can know deterministically looking forward, but we know what happened deterministically looking back. We experienced it, and it's the experience of perception and knowing exactly our experience to realize that's the way it was going to happen. The chaotic mechanism is the mechanism of not necessarily know what's going to happen. Based on possibilities and probabilities all you want. Doesn't mean that it's still a mystery to what may happen. Not like, oh, something magical will happen. There's no real such thing as magic, and magic is only things magically appearing. There's nothing or magically turning into something else. But I guess in a way, science can cure that issue. It's not magic; it's science now. It's sort of like you can call. I don't believe in gravity, and you could call gravity just the magical forces of magnetism controlling your relationship to the earth. It doesn't matter what you call it. Magic fairy dust, it doesn't matter. It's still gravity. It still exists. Your denial doesn't mean anything. Reality explains itself. You exist in it. It doesn't even need you to exist in it for it to exist itself. It still exists. Sort of like pain and deprivation still exists. Sort of like your obligation exists. Sort of like there's more pain or more suffering exists. It all exists. It doesn't matter if you make the right decision or not. It doesn't matter anything. There's still an obligation. There's still more or less pain. There's still a right choice to make. It doesn't mean it's always going to be the choice that happens, and it doesn't mean it was going to be the choice that could have been chosen. It just happens to be that it's either it's chosen or not chosen. It happens or it doesn't happen. It's something that's going to occur one way or another. Something's going to occur one way or another, and it's something you can't change. The only thing you can change is looking forward. When you look back, that's when you can realize you have no control over the circumstance. That something's going to happen, something that's all deterministic. We can realize it's based on previous events, and that's the only excuse we have. Previous events lead up to other things, and so on and so forth. I'm based on all sorts of previous events. That doesn't mean that the previous events are controlling me. They are, but I'm still the one moving forward. Even if it's previous events, doesn't mean I have the ultimate control over what can happen. It doesn't mean I'm not going to take the brunt of the consequences, because I'm something taking the consequences. And consequences only matter when it's some sentient being having either a positive or negative experience based on those interactions and those consequences of experiencing some kind of sensation. So, I mean, that stuff is really meaningful. So yeah, I guess if I want to go back to the main example again real quick, I saying? Yes, so the example I was using was, yeah, 5 broken fingers and pinkies, or pinky toe as opposed to 5 broken, um, as to 2 broken legs, and, it's a value judgment, and there's less or more obligation. More, lesser moral obligation, lesser moral obligation, lesser moral obligation. Your ethical obligation, your reasonable expectation of value, obligation. Your value obligation is that. Your ethics, your morality, your value obligation is to prevent as much suffering as possible. And if you have to take more suffering than the good that you're producing or the bad you're preventing, then it almost seems like it's not worth it. So it's about, if you're just trying to go through bad to prevent a bad, you're losing more. But if you're going through bad to achieve an orgasm or a meal, you're obviously avoiding a bad at that point. But you're getting something that's more considered overtly good, considered psychologically more overtly good societally. But say an orgasm, then still it's not worth going through the bad to get the orgasm, especially if it's not worth going through the bad to escape, a broken pinky as opposed to 2 broken legs. So it's about making the right value judgments, and the value judgments exist. It doesn't matter if you put a number on them. It doesn't matter. It still exists as an obligation. It doesn't mean you're going to make the right decision. It doesn't mean you're going to go through the obligation. It doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean you have to be happy about it. It doesn't mean that you still have the obligation. It doesn't mean you're going to be forced to or not forced to. In many cases, you are forced to. You're forced to die if a gun shot at your head. You're forced to have the bullet in your head, or whatever it is. The obligation is you're dead now. But that's not really an obligation, that's just a fact of reality. It doesn't mean you're always going to make the right decision. Just because you have the obligation to break your 2 legs or prevent 5 other people from breaking two legs doesn't mean you're going to do it. It just means the obligation's there, and that should be more of the reason to convince you that that's your obligation, and for you to be controlled by the fact that that's your obligation. Be controlled by the fact that you have a value obligation is the most important thing to consider, and realizing the effects that has, and hoping for the best. I suppose. Expect the worst, hope for the expect, but expect the worst. I suppose that's something to go through with, right? I don't know. So, yes. If there's anything to take away with that, it's just about making having the obligation. It's still there. There's still numbers. Even if you don't know the numbers, doesn't mean there's not an obligation. It's not happening. Yeah, so getting bad to escape, bad for the, so you're getting the bad to cause people to escape from the bad. It's about making the right decisions and knowing exactly what it is. Because no one person should go through infinite pain or any unreasonable amount of pain more than the other pain is experienced for the longest period of time, just to, have on the other end every other person that's existed experience a prick on the finger. One person, just about everyone get the prick on their finger, get their obligation out of the way, and to say, obviously if it's possible. If it's not possible, it's still not worth the other person suffering. But if you were to do it to avoid them getting their fingers pricked, it's not worth the one person going through the horrendous amount of suffering. Get your finger pricked, and that's the obligation you have and everyone else has now. The obligation lays on more people at that point. It just spreads out. The lesser the obligation, more likely it's because it's more people that the obligation's laid upon. Usually if you're 3 people in a band, the obligation is less on you and more on you and everyone else equally. It's just much less. But it doesn't still mean that there's an obligation there. The obligation you have is still 100%. Just because it's spread out, a greater obligation doesn't mean that your obligation still isn't 100%. It's still proportionally 100% on your part, right? Or your crew directing a movie or whatever it is. Painting a picture or making an art project, whatever it is that you're fixing. You're making a bridge, you're building a bridge, building homes. It's less on you, but you can be the person building the map. It could be more on you, but it's just not as much on you if you were the person building the whole house, doing laying the blueprints, laying the measurements and everything, nailing all the pieces together, cementing all the bricks together. If you're the person doing all that stuff, obviously it'd be all on you. But every individual thing would mean less because all the obligations would become less. But your obligation, that's another good way of looking at it. If you're just one person, all the obligations seem less. But it doesn't mean your obligation still isn't 100%, and all those things still are 100% when you're accomplishing them. It still means best to make the best product you can. But if you're like 1 in 10 people making a house, and you say you're just laying the bricks as opposed to doing the whole house, that means laying the bricks is the 100% obligation you have, and it's the thing that means the most. It means everything else. It means that you need to lay the bricks on top of the other guy doing the foundation of the house. Well, that's your main foundation. That's where 100% of your work is going. Even though it was 100% in every circumstance by yourself, it's still 100% even though you're the one doing just one. You're only doing 1/10 of the work. It's just your obligation is settled in that one specific circumstance, where that circumstance fills in all the other space that all these other things would have built up. The bricks were this big when you were building the whole house by yourself, and now the bricks are just laying the foundation of the bricks is now your full obligation, as opposed to having all these different things create the full obligation, taking more pieces. So it's either more obligations in one person, and the obligations mean less, but as a whole they all mean the same, or having 10 people, and each obligations means all that much to the one person. So the obligation is still 100%. It's just on one task, as opposed to a litany of tasks. So it's it's still proportionally 100% on your part in the end, your obligation. Regardless, it's just on one thing as opposed to 10 things. So there's 1 and the obligations mean less, but they still mean a whole, or there's 1 in 10 and you have one big obligation, but every obligation means something is in the whole, but your obligation is just entirely on that one specific thing. But it still means something all in the end, because it relies on all those other things as well. So anyway, I think I've gone on long enough in this video. Another long video. I didn't expect to make all these videos end up longer than I want them to be, and blurry. I guess it's an interesting video to have, a blurry video. So yeah, if I have anything else to say on the subject, I can always mention it in another video, but I think I've mentioned this thoroughly enough. A 17-minute video is long enough. So thank you, and until next time. Bye.